Taking chances. All right.
We are looking tonight at the emotionality of Jay Gould. And when we went through all of the personality studies, we tried to look at classic life circumstances or situations. And as we go through the emotionality, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take classics and look at them. The handouts are right there. And in this case, we're going to look at greed, one of the 7 deadly sins, because this is a good chart for doing that. This is a very difficult chart to read, emotionality in. And even though I put in a lot of time, I'm not really happy with the notes. But before we go into the astrology, let's look a little more at the desire world and the desire body. Last time we said that the desire world is a completely different world from this world, where there is a chemical region and an etheric region. And in that totally different world, there are different laws. That's because it's for a different purpose. And so things are evaluated differently. Nonetheless, there are some cosmological principles that seem to hold true on every world. There's one, for example, that holds true for all of the phenomenal worlds and our bodies in them. That is, the dense physical body, the etheric vital body, the desire body, and the concrete mind. Roughly stated, that principle could be any given body or vehicle of consciousness is built, developed, and evolved through experience and use. Any given body or vehicle of consciousness is built, developed, and evolved through experience and use. So there are different conditions for each body in each world. For example, in the physical body, you can build by using it and experiencing through it. You can build a physical body. But if you do too much, because the physical world is a very limited world, if you do too much, the physical body starts breaking down. Tiring sets in. So there's only so much you can do in bodybuilding in the physical world. However, with appropriate exercise, you can develop almost any muscle in the body. Similarly, if you practice observation, and you do so for several lives, you'll develop the painter's eye, or the ability to see things really clearly and in ways that other people can't see things. In the desire world, it's similar. The emotions, the feelings, the desires that we experience determine what our desire bodies are going to be and what our emotional life is going to be like. If we choose to be angry and selfish, that will be the basis that we build into our emotional life. If we choose to do something artistic and feel different kinds of feelings and emotions, we will grow in a different direction emotionally. You can't become jolly if you choose to be melancholy. I didn't mean the poetry of that or the sing-song line. Yeah. There are other features of the desire world and the desire body which are important. The desire body has its own values in experiencing emotions, desires, and feelings. And not not those things, not necessarily are they in the things through which the emotions are brought about. For example, the desire body doesn't find value in a piece of cake. It finds value in the pleasure of tasting that cake or in the satisfaction of attaining it. That is where it finds its value, but not in the cake itself. This is really important because it's going to determine a lot about the Jay Gould horoscope. In our last talk, we said that the desire body was very object or objective oriented. We can now see that the object orientation is because that is where it gets its motivation in being directed toward objects and objectifications or objectives. The desire body wishes to feel or to revel or to thrill or to emote, just as the vital body wants to grow and live and maintain things. That's the nature of the desire body. It wants to desire. Now there's one other feature about desire that we need to know to understand greed, as we are going to look at greed. A few minutes ago, we said that there were limits to the dense physical body and the dense physical world. We exercise too much, we tire, and things break down. One of the best examples is an intentional tiring or fatigue, and that is in the sense of taste. Taste and appetite are designed so that the taste buds shut down after a few minutes worth of eating. And that is so we don't eat too much. It's built into our physical bodies to not eat too much. However, in the desire body, these same kinds of strict limits are not present. One can experience the desire for food and the feeling of gratification in eating long after the taste buds have turned off. One can continue to revel in desires even when there isn't much sensation in the taste, not much pleasure in it. I've been one who's been guilty of greed in the form of gluttony for part of my life, and I know that it is possible to be eating and reveling in the desire and not really enjoying the eating. I've even had it happen that I was eating a meal that I anticipated and I had desired, and I wasn't even experiencing that meal. I was thinking about what my next meal was going to be. It's that kind of thing that happens in the desire world. It's a world all to itself. The same thing happens with other desires, such as sexuality. There is a limit to how much one can experience in sexual performance. However, you can desire it perpetually. And some people do just that. They live just in the desire even without physical expression. Now, in mystics, it's a common thing to say that the desire body has coalesced with the lower or the concrete mind to produce a complex that is a pseudo-self, an ego, or a lower nature, and that this pseudo-self is not the true self, which really is a self. What this means is that within our psychic being, composed thoughts, desires, and ethers, that we have in our psychic being a character which is all of its own, and it's semi-autonomous. And being semi-autonomous from the true self, it can develop and it can build things on its own. I think all of us have struggled and have recognized the struggle between the two apparent selves, only one of which is true. And in this struggle, it's to the advantage of the lower nature, to the advantage of that false ego, to skew things. Because if it sees things exactly as they are, and if it jives perfectly with reality, then it is serving the higher nature. And if it's serving the higher nature, then it loses its autonomy. So there is something that is right in the basis of our lower self that is founded on something being slightly askew. As it is, the lower nature revels in purposeless desire. It prides itself in personal lines of thought, and it takes smug conceit in personal egoism. So it is that the false egoism, with it, we build our lives around false ends, and we just get carried away with them. For example, instead of taking care of the dense physical world and treating it as a proving ground where we can finalize our part in creation, we can have a counterfeit value of the dense physical world that is ultimately empty and unsatisfying, or that is incapable of generating any healthy or complete spiritual organism from top to bottom. However, if one doesn't recognize this, there's no end to the fascination that we can have with false value and with the reveling in desire, especially desire to possess more and more. This is especially true if the excitement and the stakes go up, and the desires become more and more intense, eventually to the point where we have desperate desires. Now, this describes a syndrome of misusing all of the features of the desire body that we just spoke about. We could call this syndrome a greed syndrome. We could say that developing it in this way is the way that greed comes into human evolution. Now, all that remains is to look at the horoscope of Jay Gould and see whether the emotionality concurs with what we've just said as a general principle of the way the desire body works. Now, Jay Gould did not have a greed for food. That greed for food is usually called gluttony. This isn't surprising because he's got Gemini rising and Mercury, the strong life ruler in the first house, and there's the strong Saturnian influence throughout the character, which limits things, especially for the body where Saturn through Mercury controls and limits all first house things. So he probably ate very little. In fact, I know he ate very little because after a while he was so nervous he couldn't eat anything almost. He got by on like bird-like meals. The greed that Jay Gould had was for wealth. And in astrology, the time-tested indicator for the opportunities for wealth is the second house. And if we look at the second house in this chart, we find no surprises. Cancer, which is a very fruitful sign, is on the cusp. And when we look in the second house, we find Venus conjoined to Jupiter in Cancer. And those are the two planets that are most likely to be concerned with wealth and generosity. Pluto has been found to be a planet associated with mega wealth, that is, with plutocracy, and the influence and power that goes along with mega wealth. Pluto aspects both Venus and Jupiter in the second house. The moon rules Cancer, and in this case it rules the second house. And it also aspects both Venus and Jupiter. Now the way the moon works is like a satellite. It often reflects back astral light directed toward it. Therefore, the moon often acts as a magnifier of all of the other planets that are in aspect with it or that are involved with it in any way that is direct. And since all of these planets aspect the moon, we can see that even the moon plays into magnifying all of these factors. So we can see there are many factors converging to indicate great wealth, and there are no direct distractions from that signification. Nothing that says poverty. When we look at the aspects, all these planets are involved with each other in either a conjunction, a square, or an opposition. But that doesn't have to take away from great wealth. But it does mean trouble. Often Jupiter and Venus, when they're afflicted in the second house, means a liberal and careless expenditure that which results in the loss of wealth. It did not mean that in the life of Jay Gould. It's probably because he again had that Spartan Saturnian personality and the arresting Saturnian mind, which goes beyond the desire nature and control it. And even though there might be all of these freewheeling desires from Jupiter and Venus, neither the personality nor the mind allow them to be too active as far as putting things out into the external world.
I have a question. You said Pluto is mega wealth.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that, and also that the moon magnifies all the other planets? I don't know.
Yeah. The moon very often doesn't exhibit a character of her own. And she's one of the planets that takes every other planet and reflects it back to it. And therefore it's that planet, not quite doubled, but it is picked up somewhere. I don't know what to say. It's just that the age of plutocracy or the plutocratic people are people who just have a lot of wealth. Socrates thought that Pluto had a lot of wealth because all of the wise people died and went to Hades, which was the Greek name for Pluto, and therefore Hades had the wealth of wisdom of all of the wise people that had come before him, and that's where the wealth was. Other people speculated the same thing, that Pluto is wealthy because it inherits everything at death. And Pluto is pretty nasty, and in life, the more I go on in life, the more I see that there's nastiness over wills and inheritances. It seems like almost nobody is free from from inheritance greed. That's totally another thing.
When you said Spartan, how do you define that?
The Spartans were called Lacedaemonians or Lacedaemonians, and they were known to live on very little food, a rigorous exercise, and they lived lives that were not excessive in any which way, except maybe in courage. And so when you say somebody has a Spartan existence, it means they live on the simplest things, like they'll sleep right on straw or even on the ground if they have to. And they'll have like one little bowl of porridge, and that'll be all they have for a day. All right.
So those planets tended to form mostly, harmonious aspects. Would he have been less likely to be greedy? You know, if it was trines and sextiles rather than positions and squares and conjunctions.
That's more speculative and more far-ranging than I want to go right now.
That's just kind
Well,
of, just in general, like how the...
Well, we have 15 more horoscopes to go through, and somewhere along the line we'll find a Pluto that has all sorts of positive aspects. I'm pretty sure that'll be answered. Now, Saturn and Mercury don't directly enter into the situation with these 4 planets. So the clamping down is done indirectly through the mind and through the mercurial personality. It does enter, Saturn does enter into the martial personality, but we'll come to that much later. So he could clamp down on the desire nature, but he had to do it sort of like by a suffocation. But he didn't do that. There's no indication anywhere in his life that he tried to cut down on excessive greed. I believe that is because he had a lot of insecurity. People who are strongly Saturnine and don't have any spiritual strengths in their character are people who have a lot of insecurity. And his insecurity allowed itself to be fed or to feed the greed in the desire nature. Saturnine insecurity is adequate to keep him from spending and from having all kinds of outflows, but it also worked in such a way that he was loath to stop this syndrome, as long as it held the promise of keeping him wealthy and perhaps thereby secure. Now you could use the word selfishness to indicate instead of insecurity, but then it's a matter of which came first, the selfishness or the insecurity, the chicken or the egg. In this case, I tend to favor insecurity, though either would be satisfactory for getting at what you need to get at. The reason that I do favor insecurity is that his basic outlook in the world is mental, because Mercury is so strong, and it is not in a sensory way or in a stuff way materialistic. So if it were stuff that he wanted, then it would be more likely to be selfishness. But since it's a mental thing, it's more likely to be insecurity. Without a spiritual basis, or in this case a material basis, the insecurity is likely because of the unsubstantial nature of the mind. The mind can run through all kinds of things and dream up all kinds of things. In any case, the greed syndrome is indicated by the 4-planet T-square that is allowed to run freely both astrologically and in his life. The compromise between the mercurial lower mind and the free-flowing greed syndrome in the desire nature is just one of those very good examples of the way the desire body and the mind coalesce together to form an entity unto its own. There's sort of a cooperation. You scratch your back and I'll scratch mine. So let's try to understand the semi-autonomous greed in this character. The reason it's called semi-autonomous is because none of the planets in the T-square has a direct positive aspect to relieve the difficulties. None of them forms an outside aspect unless you want to go to fancy far-out aspects. So the T-square stands almost independent as an astrological entity in a horoscope. Yes?
Can you just diagram the T-square?
Yeah. A grand square is when there are 4 planets situated that they perform a square. A simple square is when 3 or more planets form 190 degree. A T-square is when they take up 3 of the points of a grand square. It's an unbalanced, it's the most fundamental building triangle of all the building triangles. Like all of the Platonic solids depend on the isosceles right triangle, which is what a T-square is, in order to build any of the Platonic solids on which the creation or the material creation is dependent. All right.
So you're talking about Pluto, the Moon, Venus, and Jupiter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this lives almost as an independent entity. Now, this is not foreign to psychology. Take Carl Jung, for example, who knew a great deal about the human soul. He knew that there were fractionations in the psyche, that there were complexes that lived unto themselves all alone. And sometimes they become so strong that they can even challenge the whole ego construct. And so they just, they live as entities unto themselves. And in fact, spiritual scientists would say they are entities. That if you get into a pattern of thinking the same way and emoting the same way again and again and again, eventually the forms in the desire world that are created by those desire expressions coalesce together, and they become like a little monster or a little angel or something like that. And that is something that is, it's semi-autonomous. You can go into an automatic mode with it. So it's not surprising then that it's not integrated into the other facets of the general character. However, the fact that it's not integrated isn't carried so far that he has the whole ego or lower nature invested in it and that it pulls away from the spirit, which would be complete and totally insanity, or it would be like what would be called eternal damnation. And the personality is separated in such a way that the spirit can't control it at all. So he's not that extreme. It's just that this is one thing that's inside of him. Another thing about this pattern that's interesting to us is that it is attractive even though all of the aspects are unpleasant. He does have a repulsive self-assertive side, but that's found in a much different part of the personality and in the desire body. So none of the planets in this pattern are really considered assertive. Sometimes Jupiter can be mildly assertive, as in bombast, but that's not what with this kind of a chart. It's not in Cancer or anything like that. You have to be much different conditions. But on the other hand, we've seen that he's not exactly giving either in the way that we think of somebody being really generous or eleemosynary or anything like that. He may rationalize and say that he's giving all of this to his descendants or to posterity, or he may try to generalize and say that he's giving to the ongoing evolution by developing the natural resources, but in reality, he's not really giving in these ways. Now, it's not easy for me to understand why there should be such attraction, but I'll give you the view that I have on it, and I'm not absolutely positive about it. Cancer is a drawing sign. Many of the Cancerian herbs, for example, such as chickweed, are potent drawing agents. Such as if you have something like poison ivy, you want to draw it out, the poisonous oil, chickweed in a poultice is the ideal thing to do that. Drawing is a form of attraction. And it's a form of attraction that is part of the attraction that runs throughout the desire world. but the moon, which rules Cancer, is certainly not attractive in the same way that Venus is attractive by giving herself in love. Neither Cancer nor the moon loves in a Venusian way, so the attraction has to be like of a slightly different variety. The drawing quality of the moon in Cancer is much more like the drawing power of curiosity, or what we would call interest. If you recall, we said that the basic feeling for activating in the desire world is interest. And if someone is interested in something, whether they're giving out love or not, that interest is attractive in itself. It's sort of like Tom Sawyer with the painting the fence, or if you walk through the library, and where all those tables are, you don't even have to look. You can walk with your eyes closed between the tables, and you can tell who's studying and interested in studying, and who isn't, because you find yourself attracted to certain people. Like you're drawn in, and that kind of curiosity is what's involved. Now, Venus, Jupiter, and the Moon in this pattern are not exceedingly strong planets. In fact, they are mediocre. But in this pattern, there are some really strong sub-aspects. And working together, they produce a significant strength. Now, it's a curious thing that in the English language, drawing also means to create by composing with a pencil or a pen or some other device like that. Now, in the English language, it is not a random coincidence that the two meanings are connected with a common conception like composition. They may have a lot of selfishness, as we said before, but it's not, he may have a lot of selfishness, as I said before, but it's not focused through this pattern. There is in this pattern much more of a being highly interested in the resources of wealth and drawing it to him by giving his interest. This pattern would have the same drawing ability even if there weren't the strong Saturn with the selfishness. It isn't really correct to say that he drew wealth to him because he drew pictures or made objects and in that way drew interest in wealth to him, but it isn't completely wrong either. Because he did that very thing. When he was a young man, he had invented a better mousetrap. And he went to sell the patent, or he went to sell it to somebody to manufacture them. But he knew the value of packaging, and he made this lovely wooden box that was finished and shiny, and he was carrying it on the train to New York. And somebody who was a thief saw that and said, that must be valuable, and stole it. And he noticed it immediately, and it was like a stop thief kind of situation. And people helped him out, and they caught the guy, and he got a lot of publicity out of it and sold the patent. So it is like he could draw or he could make objects that attracted the attention of other people and make money from it. But that isn't exactly, the way it worked all the time. That's just one subset of the way it worked. What would be a much more accurate way to say is that he drew interest and drew himself to money things because he had a vision. And he had a financial vision and sometimes even a little bit of a world vision. And that vision was able to attract capital. Or with that vision, he was able to see how capital could be attracted. So, Cancer is a very pictorial and drawing sign. Similarly, the Moon and Venus are two of the three most imaginative and drawing planets. The other one is Neptune, but its imagination works a little bit different. And the Moon and Venus in this horoscope form the strongest aspect in the entire horoscope. So beside being highly drawing, these two planets are also the most feminine planets of all. And a good part of femininity is receptivity. These planets both attract, but in different ways, and they both receive what they attract. And so the attraction through receptivity works very much the way a ball player sees a ball into the mitt. The mitt is a receptive thing, and by directing it, you can see the stuff, the ball into the mitt, and I think that's the way he addressed money. He had a receptivity to it. He wasn't shy. He had prosperity consciousness. He wasn't shy about being rich. He didn't think it was wrong to be rich.
Just an observation. I mean, the fact that this thief was caught stealing a mousetrap meant that it drew even the thief indirectly to being caught. I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Just in itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating the way all of these things come out. So he isn't guilty about making money. He has, even though it's in squares, Jupiter is still positive. So he's got a positive prosperity consciousness from Venus and Jupiter, and the other planets add to it. But it isn't the power of positive thinking, it's the power of positive feeling. It's like I can draw this to myself. So let's do a little bit of analysis of the strongest aspect in the chart. I did two analyses this time. I don't know how good they're going to be. Moon square Venus. Number 8, 19, 7%. Number 1 aspect, 15% of the time is functioning on it, so you can see there's a lot of potential for greed. We look at the distribution of energy. The Moon is a weak planet. Venus is exactly average, 10%. There are 10 planets, so an average planet was always going to be 10%. But the aspect is very strong. Now, this is something different than anything that we've looked at so far, and it's not something that happens very often. What it seems to indicate is that the method of directing the energy is much stronger than the planets that are using it. It's sort of like when I got the great big device from, what's this, the place out, A to Z Rental, to do the floor. I said, give me the big one. And they had a little one like that, and they got a great big one. I said, I'll be much faster to get the big. I turned it on, and that sucker just pulled me all over the room. And it just threw me against the wall and almost broke the bookcases and everything else. And that's what it's like when you have weak planets and a strong aspect. Now, these are both emotional planets, which indicates some kind of difficulties arising through emoting through the square. Since the tool is much stronger than either utilizer of it, it's something like a runaway carriage with two weak or mediocre drivers. Now, if you think about it, this is an exact description of a syndrome. A syndrome is when the method is very strong and it takes off and it does its own thing, And the participant in the syndrome, or the participants, don't have anything to say about it. It just takes off and does its thing. Now, Venus is definitely stronger, so the attractive reception is stronger than the interest reception. So that he probably liked wealth. He didn't always enjoy it. We look at the work of this. The moon represents nurturative care, defensive protection, imagination, mature women, washing or things like that, family, excitability. Venus represents loving care, and it is protection from affection, or it's artistic composition, or it's young women, or it is lubrication, or it is sociability and caring over other people for social reasons. The square itself is building and constructive, or measuring, or testing, or blocking, or crucifying. So we try to put this all together to determine what the work is. We find someone who is on the emotional level blocked, but excitable, and never shows it. There's so much fluidity that it can't be controlled. Someone who is blocked in feminine things, feminine understanding, and diverts this blockage into uncontrolled receptivity, not knowing how to use it in a more temperate, in a more artistic way. This is somebody who has vision and who has imagination and is constantly sort of building with it, but not to any special purpose. So it's sort of like just busy work. Now, in these aspects, when the moon is stronger, it's more like motherly love and blockage through protection. You're overprotected. There's more excitement than there is protection. There's more defense than there is sociability. When they're equal, there's sort of a mutual sympathy and a balance flowing between Venus and the moon. And in the square, it would be a block kind of balance, neither coquettish nor like an excitable mother. When Venus is stronger, which is the case that we have, it's like there's an affectionate attachment, a fixed love, a fixed focus of love. And that somewhat describes what's going on. Let's give a little bit more of the analysis. The square is in cardinal signs. And that indicates that it's action-oriented. But how do you square that with the square? I think what it means is that the relationship between these two feelings or these two forces in the desire world is constant in the square, even though there's all kinds of action as a result of the square, or all kinds of action in trying to change the square. The square takes place in succeeding houses, which seems to indicate that he wants to have the security and stability of investment from the second house, that he wants the more wide open elbow room of speculation from the fifth house. Now, what makes this so strong and what makes it so syndromic is that it is a mutual reception square. Mutual reception can occur with or without an aspect. It is when one planet is in the sign that is ruled by another, and the planet that rules that sign is in the sign of the first planet. So in this case, Venus is in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, and the moon is in Libra, which is ruled by Venus. And that is a mutual reception. That means that each have control over each other directly and indirectly. And mutual receptions have a quality of like being on a track, like one of those trains at a kiddie park that can never get off the track. Or it's sort of like a endless tape loop where something plays over again and again and again. It's sort of like this one block leads to another block to another block. Now the moon in Libra is probably a little bit metastable, and it can't settle down. It probably has vacillatory feelings of insecurity about speculation because it's not mothering everything completely well. And so that reflects into the second house in wanting more of it to be investment. And when investment is activated, then Venus in the second house is activated, and then she has boundless optimism about how much wealth someone can have. And because it's overblown, it knows no end, and it's unreal, and it says, why not speculate? And so it goes right back to the moon in Libra again. Now, in all of this, it goes on and on so fast that it's probably an action that's like in a blur. So that even though there is a constant in the basic structure of the square, the action itself, you know how it is, you can get into a bind and you start thinking about things, you get into a tight loop and you go over them many, many times. And I think this is something like that. All right, as we said in the very introduction of all of this, we said this is an example of living in excited, exaggerated emotion and there are objectives, such as wealth and security or legacy for the family, but the emotionality goes way beyond that into the pleasure of greedy excitement. Another reason he allows this to go is because he takes pleasure. Now, I grew up with the Donald Duck comic books. Remember Uncle Scrooge McDuck, who used to like to dive into he had this big room full of gold pieces, and he used to dive in it, and he used to be so happy doing that. Well, that is a little bit of a misstatement, but in having the greed or that desire for wealth, you can take great pleasure in that. It's not a physical pleasure. It's sort of like I don't know how you'd say it, a desire reverie of some kind or another, and I think that's what takes place.
But no matter how much wealth he ever did have, he could never feel secure, right?
Exactly. Yep. That's the picture that I'm getting out of this. Material things can never keep a pace with the desires. And after a while, he doesn't care. He cares in the way that he's still worrisome, and the Saturnian part of the character worries about it, but this is semi-autonomous, and it's enjoyable to him. It's sort of like when if you mistakenly run a red light and you chortle and you say to yourself, boy, I got away with it. It's that kind of thing, only on a much grander scale that I think takes place in him. He's hooked. And even though he worries about it, he can't do anything about it unless he brings the spirit to bear on the lower nature, and he's not a really strongly spiritual man. Or if he has to prove everything by material grounding, he could. He's not doing that either because doesn't care about that. He's not a pure scientist. He's interested in science and technology because it's ways that he can satisfy his desire to make money. The fact that he's hooked is indicated by Pluto. The Pluto aspects with the emotional planets, Venus and the Moon, though they are weak, show some kind of emotional obsession. Like the Moon, Pluto afflictions often manifest as a cleanliness obsession. Mama's looking over your shoulder, so you really have to clean things up, and even after they're cleaned up, they're still not clean enough. And because with obsession, you never can satisfy it. You can, the energy that goes into satisfying it can, like if you're trying to eradicate a desire by destroying it, the energy that you put into eradicating the desire strengthens the desire. And obsessive or what are called obsessive compulsive characters can never overcome by a direct frontal attack. You cannot eradicate something if you're making it strong by the very fact that you're trying to eradicate it. Venus and Pluto afflictions are sometimes love obsessions. But I don't think in this case it was a love obsession, or you could say the love of money. But it appears to be something much more like a fascination with wealth. It's an impossible desire for social acceptance and power, and it's a love fascination with wealth and with speculation. Now, since he has all these tendencies to speculation, we have to make it clear right away that he's not a gambler. He's not a risk taker. He's much too Saturnian for that. Again, the mind has control over what the desires actually produce in terms of external actions, and the mind also controls the personality, so he would never consider doing something with unsafe speculation. However, he does not stop at the vision or at the dreaming about speculation, which he allows to go on ad infinitum. He probably enjoys it. He probably doesn't have any other vision in his life. Nothing else. He's sort of starving for something of real value. He's sort of like when Nixon was president. Nixon didn't know how to enjoy the power of the presidency. He was too nervous, and he went through the forms and thought he should desire it, but he really didn't enjoy the presidency. He was terribly uncomfortable with it. Yes.
You're saying that he enjoyed it. The other thing that comes to my mind is because Pluto's in Aries, he likes the challenge of it.
That's coming from a different something else. You're picking up something in the character, but I don't think it comes exactly from that. There is something revolutionary about that, because when Pluto was in Aries is when Simón Bolívar liberated all the Spanish-speaking countries of South America. And so there was an energy that was challenging to high powers, and that ended in very active rebellion and not just seditious attitudes. So that is there, but I don't think that's the real strong thing, because if that were, that would bring in more of the repulsiveness. And what we're talking about here is, Pluto, it's very hard to turn down Jupiter, Venus things, because it's so pleasant. It's a tough one. All right. I didn't have a lot of time to be thorough. So what's going to follow, or what the whole night is tonight, is a little bit light, and it's all put together on the run. If we had done this in a very thorough way, it would probably have taken 2 or 3 classes to go through everything.
Richard?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I noticed that he has some really tight. Wouldn't that kind of, couldn't he have been more spiritual? I mean, I know there were a lot of negative aspects.
Yeah, but let's, in about 2 or 3 years, when we get to the spiritual, when we get to the spirituality.
I just wanted like a one-sentence answer. I didn't want to go into a whole.
A one-sentence answer is that that very topic is addressed in at least 20 or 30 sentences. Yes, the possibility is there, but the gestalt of the whole character does not allow for it.
Okay, thanks. That's all I wanted.
That is a possibility. This is why it's not wise to leap before you look. When you get the gestalt of the whole character, then you can see what things are likely to work what way and what things are likely to work another way. All right, we've got Jupiter square Pluto. Number 7, 148, 9%. Number 4, 90, 12%. Number 10, the weakest planet of all, 92, 6%. So let's look at the structure or the distribution of the energy. This is again one of those uncommon cases where you have weak planets, and in this case both planets are weak. Jupiter is only modestly weak, but they're involved in a strong aspect. Even though it's number 4, it's still a pretty strong aspect, because when we did the activity profiles, we saw that there were a lot of intense aspects in this horoscope. And that usually means a person who's action-oriented, that the whole life is a matter of decisive action. And I think his whole life is designed that way. You can't be tentative and hesitant if you're going to be an entrepreneur, especially if you're involved with investment or speculation. You've got to act, and you have to act timely, and you have to act decisively. I think maybe it's possible, though this may be stretching a little bit, that the greed syndrome that we're looking at charges him up so that he is all eager to act decisively. And he's got enough control so that he can act decisively. Now, the peculiar thing about this aspect, which is like the Venus square moon, is that it indicates being stuck in an unprogressive syndrome. Only this case is more stuck, and it's stuck in a different way. Not because it's tracked, and not just because it's affixed to a cross that it's unable to get out of it, but he's stuck due to the aspect being so strong. And normally, planets are like people. And people utilize aspects like we utilize, planets utilize aspects like we utilize tools. And they express themselves and do their work through the tools. But when the aspect is strong, it's going to work in its own way. You can't make it do something that it wasn't meant to do because you don't have that much control over the tool that you're using. And so the planets, again, are carried along. They're actually dragged out in a sort of a stereotypical way that is not necessarily favorable to their ends or to the planetary things that they're seeking. So this makes another pretty good definition of a syndrome. If we look at the work, Jupiter represents expansion and optimism and plenty and ideas, ideals, and principles, and levity and inflation. Pluto represents power in potential. It represents influence, intensity, fixity, absolute pressure, a kind of coldness, and a perversion. It's possible that at least when it's in the square, it's a great perversion. From this, we can draw all kinds of conclusions. We can say that it has to do with huge expansions of power and influence to the degree of plutocracy. He was born right in the middle of what is called the Gilded Age, or the plutocratic age. It was the age when those Plutonian things were built, the corporations and the trusts. And we're in that same stage of the cycle now, and companies are gobbling each other up hand over fist, and with the same kind of cold Plutonian quality about the combinations of corporations.
Two questions?
Yes.
First one. The fact that Pluto is in Aries, though, would that not indicate more of a power in action?
It could, but I think that the planet is stronger than the influence of the sun.
Okay. Second question. The fact that even though they're not fixed signs, the fact that this square takes place in what would normally be in the houses of fixed signs.
Yes, we're coming up to that.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
There's a trouble with having an intuitive class. They anticipate everything ahead of time. Ellen is 3 years ahead of me already. Now, don't feel bad about it. You're asking the right kind of question. So, you could say that this has to do with exaggerated ideals. Because if you look at his life, it's the American dream to want to make $1 million. And there's nothing to keep you from doing that. You can scratch and claw your way to it. So his life is sort of a perversion of the great American ideal, of the great American dream. The way it worked most in his life is he sought absolute wealth or absolute plenty. And that's the description of monopoly. This is a man that was very much involved with monopoly. At one time, he owned most of the railroad stocks in the country. He owned the whole Erie Railroad. He owned the Union Pacific, the Kansas Pacific, and one of the Western Pacifics. I forget which one it was. In fact, it was one of his great goals in life to be the only owner of a coast-to-coast railroad. There has never been a single company or organization that has owned a coast-to-coast railroad. He got really close, and all that was left was something like the Rio Grande in Texas or something like that, which was one little tiny railroad, and he got into a big bidding war over that. And then his Saturn just checked in and said, hey, I can't spend this kind of money on this tiny little thing. And he never did get the railroad that he, eventually when he toured the country with his daughter, he had to go on another railroad company with his private car. At one time, New York used to have elevated rail systems, and he owned all of them. And he pulled all kinds of shenanigans to own all of them. At one time, he owned Western Union. He always had this absolute thing. Well, if you corner the market, if you have the whole market, everybody is beholden to you. But if you've got this kind of insecurity and this Jupiter-Pluto thing, you want the absolute biggest that you can get, which is the all, which is the total, and that's the way it worked in him. Let's look at quality a little bit. If there are benefic aspects between Jupiter and Pluto, I've noticed that the person who has such a benefic aspect is always a power for the good. They are living power for the good. It also has to do with very great wealth, and very great wealth through large organizations, even if you're just a stockholder. And it indicates someone who is very trustworthy and reliable as an authority. In the malefics, which is our case, it represents an insatiable quest for power, especially unattainable power. He tried to corner the whole market, and he never could. It also indicates in the malefics bigotry or moral arbitrariety and prejudice. And in his case, it was an insatiable desire for wealth. If you look at it specifically as the square, you could say that this square is, you could describe it in one word. You could say that it's a blockbuster. It's the big power square. When you look at the relative strengths of the planets, If Pluto is stronger, the pleasantries amount to almost nothing. They're just a formality. It is power and despotic power, whether it's good or bad. If it's balanced, planets, when they're in balance, always rotate to each other or circulate to each other. Power gives beneficence, beneficence gives power, and it goes back and forth. If Jupiter is stronger, which is our case, it represents need for constant expansion. And it's almost like the notion, it's not a closed system when Jupiter is there. Pluto likes closed systems. Everything dies so something new can come, and the same material is recycled again and again. Pluto is recycling. But when Jupiter is there, it's open-ended like Sagittarius in the 9th house. There's no end to it. And the whole idea of the gross national product getting bigger and bigger and bigger is sort of like a Jupiter stronger than Pluto in an aspect kind of attitude. The principle is more important than the demand that the principle puts on you. The signification or the signification, these are in cardinal signs. It indicates that something has to be done with or for power. There's something administrative about this kind of power or this kind of seeking for power. But the administrative quality is not like the Saturnian Capricorn 10th house that does things in a structured, efficient way. It's more like some dedication to an ideal, almost like in Japanese industry where people are dedicated in almost a fascistic way to the whole structure. Looking at the Dhammification, these things occur in succeedent houses. And succeedent houses can mean a number of things. Certainly, in this case, it doesn't mean freedom. Even though he may have that in mind, he may want to have material freedom, it doesn't indicate that. The succeedent houses also represent responsibilities. There is an imperative feeling. He feels that he has to do this, so there is some responsibility-bound quality to this square. And the other way you can look at the succeedent houses is that one pole of them, the 2nd and the 8th, is the means pole. And the 5th and the 11th is the expression pole. So it's a struggle for an unending security and wealth in investment that's pitted against an obsession with speculation and impersonal speculation at that. That should give enough to get an understanding of the elements in this pattern. Now let's try to talk a little bit. We're almost done here, aren't we? Wow. Fast.
The 5th house deals with, is the house that deals with speculation?
5th and the 11th both.
Oh, the 11th too?
Yeah. The 5th is a little bit more personal about speculation and is a little bit more gamey about it. The 11th house is, let's just take a flinger sort of thing, if you just a pure expression. All right. The interest quotient in this chart is in the form of curiosity. Curiosity about how to acquire wealth. There is a lot of constructive, destructive activity for acquiring wealth, so much so that there is fluctuation and excitability which almost dominate control. Much of the motivation comes through images, and even if the images are self-made or visionary, they're still attractive. You can make something, you can draw something and say, wow, that's beautiful. And you can look at it because it is beautiful, and you can be attracted to your own image process. In the whole pattern, there is a syndrome of receptivity, imagination, and drawing through visionary but untrue values. The desire is to acquire huge, constantly expanding, absolutely and obsessively wealth. It's insatiable. Not only is it visionary and artificial, it's speculative, but still under the control of the mind. That's a pretty good definition of greed. A greed in an attractive emotionality. But you wonder about it. Jupiter rules foolishness or folly. And you wonder about the folly of this. This is what happens when you think in terms of one life and one life only. There are some good things because you have to work really, really hard. If you think that you can only get salvation in one life, you really put your nose to the grindstone. But if you think materialistically the way he did, why not get as much wealth as I can? It's probable that in a future life, though I don't know enough to say, probably in a future life he's likely to be poor because he blew all of his money-making karma in this life. It's gone. All right, now let's take a look for a few minutes at the Mars nature, the repulsive nature. Of the three primary emotionality significators, Moon, Venus, and Mars, in this chart, Mars is the strongest of the three. So there is plenty of repulsive energy present. Mars is in detriment, and its strongest aspect is a malefic opposition to Saturn, which is the most malevolent of the secondary emotional significators. And Saturn is very strong. So not only is there plenty of energy for repulsion, there really are repulsive things in the character. Now, we don't have time for another aspect analysis, so we're probably never going to get a chance to come back to this aspect in this chart, because we'd be here too long. I don't want it to be too long. It drives people away eventually. Anyway, though, looking at it very briefly, this aspect is a very primitive and savage aspect. And it has some of the basest and the nastiest of all human actions, emotions, and motives to it. Selfishness, there's violence, there's vindictiveness, there's destruction, there's coarseness, all of those things. When you look at the desire nature in the way that we're looking at it, the opposition seems to indicate ambivalence. Ambivalence between self-assertion and repulsive action and selfish holding of objects. Saturn would hold things constant, and Mars would constantly be acting in that repulsive way. You can't take a planet and knock it out of the sky, so neither can be nullified, but one can be more prevalent. But if you look at the tot sheets, these planets are virtually equal in strength, and by approximation. However, in general, from the looking at the quality of his life, Saturn seems to have just a little bit more of an edge, perhaps more than that 1 point that we give it in the approximation business. Now the thing is, in the same way that the greed syndrome was given sway to do whatever it wanted to build up to action, but not given the ability to act itself, something similar happens with this aspect. He never expressed active malice in his life. He had others do it. He did it indirectly, intellectually, and artificially. He even did it to his friends, but he never did it directly himself. This brings us to something that we haven't done so far in this class, and we're going to do a little bit of it tonight, and that is looking at planetary people. It is a universal principle in astrology that every significant person in your life represents one or more of the planets, usually one that stands out. And every planet in your life represents one or more significant people. For example, no one wants to be the Saturn in somebody's life, though sometimes they are. One of the strongest martial people that was most indicated, like the horoscope in the life of Jay Gould, was a man named Jim Fisk. And Jim Fisk was co-owner with Jay Gould of the Erie Railroad. Now, Jim Fisk was everything that Jay Gould was not. He was outwardly bold and flamboyant. He lived what would be called a colorful life. When they owned the Erie Railroad, they had their offices in the Opera House. They bought an Opera House for their office building. And Jim Fisk was getting involved in all kinds of dicey things with wild women and brawls and things like that. He was very verbal. And he made the newspapers a lot. He was in, something violent would come out, Fisk does this, and that was sensationalism in the newspapers. And Jay Gould used him. They were friends and they were partners, but he was a publicity ploy, and he kept other people attracted. And this is just like Mars in Taurus. It's not at its best, and it comes out with some of its brawling things, and there's a lot of womanizing there. And Jay Gould could recognize that, hey, this is a good billboard that I can use this guy. Eventually, he became too much of a liability, and eventually he was not good for the business, and Jay Gould undercut him. He did the thing where secretly he traded under another name, and Jim Fisk put all of this money thinking that, wow, this is going to be a big thing, and then Jay Gould pulled it all off, and everything just fell flat. He broke him, and this is the kind of treachery that Jay Gould was likely to do. Even his friends, he had no conscience that way. It was a no honor among thieves kind of situation. Now, when we just talked about the T-square, we mentioned the likelihood of Jay Gould euphemizing over his greed by saying, well, I'm doing this to develop the country or something like that. There's the possibility of something like that actually occurring here. The 5th and the 11th houses are houses that show opportunities for speculation. And speculation is sort of a what-if game. What if I do this? What will come out of it? And so the 5th and the 11th house are houses of games as well as of speculation. Now, very few among us are willing to admit or to confess to our savage primitive parts. That's the first thing you have to do in order to transform them or to correct them, is you have to admit to them. Usually, our base and our savage parts are hidden from us. We don't even know we have them. We like to think that we're fine, ordinary people. But if we were fine and ordinary people and didn't have an untrustworthy side, we would all be saints, or we would all be entrusted with spiritual powers. We would be initiates, but we can't be initiates because we've got these things beneath the surface. So it's very likely with this aspect that Jay Gould took the attitude of, this is all just the way the game is played. You play rough. And it's all the way the game is, and that's probably the way he did. He has the sun in the 12th house. It's buried there under all kinds of refuse from past life, and he doesn't actually want to be involved in facing up in his self-nature to everything in his character. Now, fierceness, nasty dishonestness in competition were a big part of his life. And with this aspect, it's clear to see that it was selfish competition. He was motivated selfishly to compete. But we haven't yet determined in this chart which played the bigger part, the competition or the emotional greed. We don't have a chance to do that because it takes a big analysis, and that's something you can do on your own to try to figure out which characteristic is stronger. You can do that when you're not reading biographies. I'm merciless. One of the big competitors in his life was Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was another planetary person. But Vanderbilt was much different than Jim Fisk. He was crafty and cautious, but he was conservative, over-conservative and self-limiting. He was sort of snobbish and priggish and old-fashioned in his ways, and so he was more of the Saturnine figure. And they had all kinds of competitions. I'll just tell just one. At one time, Vanderbilt decided he was going to get rid of the comeuppance Jay Gould by taking away the Erie Railroad from him. And he was going to do it by buying all the stock. And so he proceeded to buy the stock on the market, and Jay Gould went into the opera house, into the basement, and set up a printing press. And as fast as Vanderbilt would buy the stock, he printed new stock. It was watered down, just like Jupiter in Cancer is. Watered down value. It's exaggerated, it's undercapitalized, and that's the way it worked. And what the upshot of it was, Vanderbilt got some goons out, and he got some laws against Jay Gould, and Jay Gould actually had to flee New York in a motorboat and go across to the Jersey side, and eventually it broke down to a duel of who could be the most immoral in terms of legislative activity. And they both went to Albany when the legislature was in session and was going to be making laws that affected this suit over the Erie Railroad. And they literally went from one floor to another with suitcases full of money. And they bought off legislators, and then they would outbid each other. And finally, Vanderbilt, with his caution, he was the Saturn one. He couldn't bid that high. He didn't want to spend that much money, and Jay Gould bought off the legislature and kept the railroad. But that's the way they competed. Jay Gould had his own pet judges. That he'd get things directed to such and such court, and that judge was paid off and was in his pocket, and he'd get the judgment that he wanted or that he thought he needed. Not to say that Vanderbilt didn't do the same thing. Now, one of the most common things to all Saturn and Mars aspects, especially the afflictions, is frustration. Frustration of energy that becomes vicious and violent in destruction. Now, he was never physically violent. In fact, he wouldn't even face the people that were his adversaries face to face. But he did put violence into play. So this opposition is a frustration opposition. And in general, it sums up his entire desire and emotional nature as well. He was never motivated to build something for the benefit of the world. He built things in order to compete, and he let them go to pieces. He built shoddily. He never built for the sake of building. He even took advantage of conditions and weaknesses during the Second World War, during the Civil War. He was involved with selling rusty rifles to the northern. He was a nasty man. All of his enterprises in which he did build, all of them were ruses for investing advantage. And he never did much to maintain anything that he held, and everything that he owned deteriorated when he was at the helm. All that counted was profit. But the profit was not for something he could enjoy, but it was because of that syndrome emotionally that wanted more and more all the time. So he had this that he could never satisfy, but it was a constantly escalating thing, and that's what his whole life was. It's the competitive nature in playing the games that he never really duked it out with anybody, but he found treacherous ways to undo them. The only thing that he had in his life that was physically satisfying was his greenhouse. He spent loads and loads of time in the greenhouse with all kinds of rare and beautiful plants, but that's the only place that he had anything near peace and where he wasn't totally frustrated. He never left anything to posterity. He left his children a lot of money, but he never took part in their lives unless they pushed the issue and did things with him. And his oldest daughter was the only one who did that. So his whole life was artificial. It wasn't real. And all of his values, not yours in the second house, but all of the emotional values were filled with falsity. So it's no wonder that he's frustrated, because he can't really do anything where a person feels satisfaction without frustration. Even in his emotions, which were also focused artificially, he was never allowed to give them full play, because if he had, then they would have taken off and he would have done all kinds of risky things. So this is a chart or an emotionality of frustration. He was emotionally frustrated. That's it.
In the beginning, you made a statement, I'll scratch my back, you scratch yours, and I think you meant to say it the other way, right?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't make any difference. It's you scratch each other's back.
Each other's, not your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, did I say your own?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what happens when you're a standalone guy like I am.
You did a very
get all self-centered.
I have one of those.
I use a hairbrush.
Oh, yeah, but
Sometimes
sometimes you need something longer.
Yes.
the only thing that gave him pleasure, like physical pleasure, was his greenhouse. Is that indicated in the chart as well?
No, I think that is some of that comes out of the planets in Cancer in the second house. There are some positive things to that conjunction, and a loving for something and nurturing and caring for it. And even the square kicks in there because it was basically a hobby. I think he had some of those night blooming cereus that only bloomed one day, and they only bloomed at night. And he was in tears at seeing the night blooming cereus come into bloom. It's something real. Not to say that emotions aren't real, but his were artificial. Thank you very much.
The fact that he had all that Saturn